Hello. I'd like to welcome you all to our second, you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Okay. I want to thank you all for coming. Welcome to our second World Affairs Lunch of the semester. And there's lots more to follow. We're particularly happy to greet you today help me welcome my son back to the forum, but to spare you any rantings of a proud Jewish mother, I'm going to turn the mic over to good friend and colleague Bill Rao to do the intro.
Welcome, everyone, to the University of Scranton's Heritage Room for an event sponsored by the Schemmel Forum under the sagacious guidance of a board of directors and supporters, a community. Thank you, members, and by the tireless energies of Sandra Meyer. It is a delight to be here to welcome my dear friend David Myers back to the University of Scranton. He's a son of the university, having finished his senior year, what it would have been his senior year in high school, here in the academic year 77-78, before moving on to Yale University with a year at Tel Aviv, and then Harvard University for an MA, and Columbia University for his PhD. We met in 1995. And teamed up on concerning a special project, a conference project here, which morphed into a book and pleasurable, almost 20 years now of association and friendship. We're gathered to consider some very important things today. People, land, nation, state. Isn't it interesting what was invented as a solution has become a source of problems? A sort of wedge has opened up between, well, heritage and room. And we're here to discuss some particular problems which David has some important things to tell us about. Well, without further ado, would you please greet with me David Myers.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Is the microphone amplified? So I should just speak loudly, or we can find a way to maybe turn up the mic. Those would be the two solutions. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, to be back here. This is the third year that I have been delivering a lecture at the university in the Schemmel Forum. So I'd like to first thank the director of the Schemmel Forum for the gracious invitation to return. I guess it hasn't been enough of a disaster to warrant consideration anew of the invitation. I'd also like to thank my dear friend Bill Rao for making time out of his busy schedule to come and listen and offer his opening words. And I'd like to thank you for making time. And particularly I'd like to thank the students from Marywood University for coming, right over there. It's a pleasure to see you. So it's always a bit of a challenge when my mother asks me in the spring about what would you like to speak on the Middle East, because you can be sure that whatever the announced topic is in May will have to be altered by the time September or October rolls around. And indeed, that's the case. I had originally planned to speak about Israel, Palestine, and Syria, which seem to be particularly pressing at the moment. And we are going to cover those two subjects, but I have added another area of contestation and interest to us, namely Iran, to the mix. And I would say all three of them are interconnected in ways that we'll try to elaborate over the course of time. But at the outset, I'd like to try and identify three themes that we'll be following over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. One of them is a theme that I discussed last time when I spoke in the Schemmel Forum, at the end of that presentation, I talked about my sense that we're on the verge of a new era in the Middle East in which we will see the rise of what I called the middle states in size and power. And I thought of three of them: Egypt, Turkey, and Iran. the Middle States which would come to dominate or at least play a very significant role in shaping the course of events in the Middle East. To a certain extent, that prediction has been borne out, and to a certain extent, not yet. But what I think the rise of the Middle States attests to is the terminal stages, we might say, of the process of Western decolonization of the Middle East. That is to say, the end of a long, century-long, maybe even more than century-long period of Western colonialism in which Western colonial powers played a decisive role in shaping the course of events in the Middle East. I think we're seeing the end of that, although we do have to take stock of the inherited structures from that era of Western colonial and imperial domination over the Middle East. Most importantly, as Bill alluded to in his opening remarks, the existence of the nation state, which was seen as Bill said, as a solution to a number of the pressing ethnic, religious, and geographic problems of the Middle East, and a replacement to earlier imperial and smaller community models of group organization that existed previously. So one theme that we're going to follow is the continuation of that process of the retreat of Western colonial powers from the Middle East, and of course that brings us to the question of American influence in that region as well as in the world. Just as I think we've seen declining influence of Western powers, so too, of course, I think we can point to the decline of American power in the Middle East and in many other places around the world, and that's a theme I'd like to illustrate. The second theme that I want to follow is to call our attention to ongoing tensions between two varieties of Arab and Muslim cultures in the Middle East, one of which strains toward the pole of a kind of Western and even secular attitude, and another which strains towards a more traditional Islamist pole. So that's something that I want to follow through. And then third, I want us to pay attention to what is a very pressing issue within a number of the hotspots that we're going to be looking at, namely the intramural friction between competing Muslim groups, most significantly in the case of Syria between Sunni and Shiite Muslims. So let's begin with a bit of a status report on Syria. Okay. I'm sorry about the lightness of the, I can't apologize for the sun. I'm delighted it's sunny. I'm sorry it has some deleterious effects on the screen, but we'll make our way through. So when we talk about Syria, we're really thinking of that dizzying pace of events since that precipitant that doesn't bear the most accurate name, namely the Arab Spring, in that the events that came to be known as the Arab Spring really commenced in the winter of 2010, 2011, not in the spring of 2011. But what is relevant for our purposes is that things really begin to pick up with considerable alacrity in March 2011 when protests break out throughout Syria. And very much as an outgrowth of the Arab Spring, with the emergence of those populist movements straining against authoritarian rule in a number of Arab countries. The protests in Syria were very much focused upon the individual at the left, namely Bashar Assad, the president of Syria, who in 2001 assumed that position from his father, Hafez Assad, who ascended to the reins of power in the year 1971 and ruled for almost 30 years. So we've had 40 years or so of Assad family rule, marked by a very authoritarian and often brutal approach to power that has generated considerable resentment in Syria that was largely suppressed with a number of exceptions until March of 2011, when there were popular uprisings. those who began to protest against the Assad regime were a very interesting mix of groups: secularists, socialists, as well as Islamists, all of whom strained against the rule of the Assad family for very different reasons, but who began to coalesce into a coherent and rather significant movement of protest in that spring of 2011. The dissidents included some soldiers disgruntled with the manipulation of the armed forces by the Assad family, as well as a number of civilian opponents. At that point, in the spring of 2011, the conflict, as it was, between the Assad regime that controlled all significant reins of government and this emerging band of dissidents was completely imbalanced. It was asymmetrical warfare and conflict in its purest form. You had a very loose coalition of under-equipped dissidents versus the very powerful military of the Assad regime. And that's how this conflict began, and I guess I would suggest that it's precisely at that moment, with that constellation of opposing forces, that probably would have made the best moment for an American intervention, for American support, for unequivocal American support. Because what came after was a very significant complicating factor. There was the sense beyond the borders of Syria. So up to that point, the first month, 2 months, even 3 months of the conflict, there was a sense amongst Syrian dissidents that this was an opportunity to throw out 40 years of Assad rule and create a new Syria. Others, gazing at Syria from the outside, saw it as a different kind of opportunity. They saw it as a new flashpoint in a global battle, the global battle known as jihad. And we see, by the summer of 2011, Sunni militants, loosely connected with al-Qaeda, making their way to Syria in order to overthrow the secular, and as we will see soon, Shiite-based regime of Bashar Assad. They saw this as a new and very important front in the battle to assert Sunni control, and not just Sunni control, but a very particular kind of Sunni Muslim vision associated with the restoration of the great Muslim caliphate, the great Muslim kingship, which they saw as the ultimate goal of their war, and removing a secular infidel from control in one important Muslim state was a very important task. So flowing into Syria by the summer of 2011 were Shiite militants intent on fomenting jihad in that country. That is a significant complication to the composition of the opposition in Syria. And it became a very serious complication for Western powers that also felt an interest in either diminishing the power of or removing Mr. Assad from power. He had been a thorn in the side of the West for a very long time. It initially seemed as if his time had come. However, by the summer of 2011, we have this new complication with the infusion into that country of Sunni militants who have a very different vision of what a post-Assad Syria should look like. To further complicate matters, in response to the original rebellion against Assad, and then in even greater response, indeed, out of desperate fear, out of a tipping of the balance of power in Syria to this Sunni side, the neighboring militant organization, Shiite militant organization based in Lebanon, Hezbollah, began to amplify considerably its support for the Assad regime, such that what we see in Syria is a very interesting and potentially catastrophic battle between two variants of Islam. Sunni Islam, and particularly the Wahhabi version of Sunni Islam associated with Al-Qaeda, and Shiite Islam, which in the case of Syria is associated with the Assad family, and I'll explain that in a little bit, and with Assad's most important military allies, Hezbollah, the militant organization based in Lebanon, and ironically enough, Syria's most important regional partner, Iran, also a major Shiite stronghold. So you have a sense here of the overwhelming majority of Sunni Muslims in the Muslim world. They constitute about 85% of the world Muslim population. However, Shiite Muslims are a majority in Iran, about 90%, Iraq, about 65%. In Syria, Shiite Muslims constitute about 15% of the population. So it's a Sunni country ruled by Shiites, and not just by Shiites, by a rather secretive sect of Shiite Muslims known as the Alawites, to which the Assad family belongs, as do many of the leading figures in the political and military establishment. So you can get a sense rather quickly of how the conflict in Syria, which began as a form of political protest against an authoritarian regime, has become a very fierce internecine sectarian struggle between Shiites and Sunnis. And indeed, it is a major battleground in that war. Let me just say a brief word about the origins of the divisions between Shiites and Sunnis. Shiite Islam adheres to the belief that the fourth caliph after the Prophet Muhammad, Ali, who was the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, was divinely designated to be Muhammad's successor, and that others who came before him, the three caliphs who came before him, did not have that same degree of authority. Sunni Muslims believe in the traditional chronology of the caliphate and do not believe that Ali was a figure designated by God who should be adhered to and revered in ways quite different from the others who preceded him, Omar, Abu Bakr, and Ottoman. So the division between Sunnis and Shiites extends back to the early years in the history of Islam, to the 7th century, with Shiites revering the Caliph Ali as one of the great figures after Muhammad in the Islamic tradition, whereas Sunnis adhere to the prophecy of Muhammad and then the normal chronology of leaders who followed him. So these are theological divisions that over the course of time really transformed as well into political divisions, particularly because you can see this map where only a few countries actually now have a Shiite majority. Much of the Sunni world has accepted the existence of Shiite Muslims, though some Sunni clerics still regard the Shiites as deviant and unacceptable within the bounds of the global community of Muslims in the world. To add a further layer of complication to that division between Sunnis and Shiites, I mentioned that the Assad family was not only Shiite, but belonged to this rather secretive offshoot of Shiite Islam known as the Alawite sect. The complication in the story is that Assad, father and son, belonged to an important political force in the Arab world that takes rise around 1947. That is the Baath Party, which saw itself as devoted to the ideals of both socialism and nationalism. So it sought to throw off the yoke both of traditional Islamic political and religious leadership, and, for that matter, the yoke of Western colonial influence. The word Baath comes from the Arabic word for renaissance and or resurgence. It is characterized by its commitment to a very particular form of secular nationalism associated with socialism. It defined itself from its inception up to the present as opposed to Western imperialist rule, and it has been marked in its two most important iterations, namely in Syria and in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was also an adherent of Baathist ideology. It has been marked by a very ferocious kind of authoritarian rule. So the Baath Party has sought for really generations to introduce this new form of secular nationalism into the Middle East, and it has done so in ways that has led to very significant loss of life. One curious feature of Baathist rule that helps explain the division of power in the Middle East. The Baathists have been, as I said, quite antithetical to, opposed to Western influence in the Middle East. This is one reason why Syria found itself under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And to a certain extent, Russian support today for the regime of Assad is a legacy of the Soviet Union's support for the Syrian Baathists in the days of the Cold War. The Russians today justify their support for Syria as an essential bulwark against Islamic extremism. As you know, the Russians feel threatened and beleaguered by their own form of homegrown Islamic militants, particularly in Chechnya, and believe that the way to retard the growth of such forms of militant behavior is to support the secularists in the region, of whom there are relatively few. Assad is one, and that explains Russian support for his regime. As you can see, Russia under Putin is a rather strange bedfellow with Iran, the other major regional supporter of Syria. And this is one of the interesting and curious features of the conflict as we see it today. I've mentioned on various occasions the resistance of Syria and the Baathists to Western imperial rule. So let me say a little bit more about that. We should probably extend back even beyond the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 to the preceding regional power, namely the Ottoman Empire, which by the early decades of the 20th century found itself in a rather decrepit state, in a state of dissolution and decline. And this provided a new opening for Western imperial powers. The First World War really hastened the dissolution of the three major imperial forces of the day, namely the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Out of the First World War, and owing to the dissolution of those imperial powers, came the rise of nation states. But before we get there, it's important to note that the British and French during the First World War were conspiring to really take advantage of the decline of the Ottoman Empire and to capture for themselves the spoils of war, to divide the Middle East into their own spheres of influence. And this agreement, hatched by two diplomats, one British and one French, divided much of the Middle East into spheres of influence. The A zone would fall under the control of the French, and that included Syria and Lebanon, parts of Turkey. The B zone would include Transjordan, parts of Iraq, and, as we know, in its own special status, Palestine. And the British and French would operate somewhat amicably, so the assumption was, knowing full well what the borders of their neighbor's sphere of influence was. This was sort of a grand imperial ideal, motivated by, in some cases, the classic French civilizing mission, and more commonly by a desire to really gain access to the resources of the Middle East. When the French took control of Zone A, they initially divided Syria into 3 or 4 different autonomous regions, according to ethnic and religious composition, as well as to major centers of power. So there was an autonomous region of Damascus, the capital city of Syria today. There was an autonomous region for Aleppo, which is the largest city in Syria, and 2 others that reflected the ethnic and religious proclivities of the people of Syria. Ultimately, there was pushback amongst people in Syria against this division of the country, according to these seemingly artificial boundaries. And in the great age of nationalism that followed the First World War, Syrian rebels banded together and fought against French colonial rule and agitated for independence, which was provisionally granted in 1936, though really not until 1941 did an independent Syria as we know it today take rise. So out of that colonial intervention, which originally tried to divide and conquer, emerged the nation state, which the French accommodated themselves to in the hopes that they might be able to exert some influence over Syria. I'm sorry, I said 1941. 1946 is when an independent Syria takes form. And the French no longer have the direct control that they did, but nonetheless hope to exert some influence. And that, I would say, was an ongoing tale of frustration for the French from 1946 to the present. The British, just to catch up, controlled Zone B and Palestine. And as we know, their control over Palestine was fraught with all sorts of conflicts and tensions. In 1947, they agreed to withdraw their mandate from Palestine, which led the United Nations to commission a group of people to arrive at a solution, which in late November 1947 was voted upon by the United Nations General Assembly, and that called for the partition of Palestine, which we'll go back and talk about in just a minute. So the Baathists, to go back to Assad, were very much committed to overthrowing any remaining legacy of Western imperial control in Syria. And that required them, from their inception, to make use of very brutal methods. And in particular, the Assad family has not hesitated to use extraordinary brutality in order to suppress dissent within its own ranks. So famously, or I should say infamously, in 1982, Assad the father, Hafez al-Assad, when faced with a protest movement in the town of Hama, sent his forces into that city, who essentially razed it to the ground, killing in the process, estimates are 20,000 people. An action that provoked the outrage of the larger world for a tragically brief moment. That same kind of brutality also has marked the regime of Hafez Assad's son, Bashar, and we are more familiar with that episode, which occurred on August 21st, 2013, when Assad's forces made extensive use of chemical weapons, drawing on their quite large chemical weapon arsenal against a mix of civilians and opposition forces in a region on the outskirts of Damascus. This chemical attack led to at least 1,300 deaths and thousands of other injuries. And it's that attack that caught the attention of the international community. Because a year before, our own president declared the following: "We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is when we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized." This is the famous red line that, in a certain sense, boxed President Obama in to foreign policy action and led to that dizzying series of events that led him first to contemplate very seriously military action, then to seek congressional authorization. But before that deliberation over authorization proceeded, we recall, owing to a stray line at a press conference made by Secretary of State John Kerry, the American government joined forces with the Russians, the patrons of the Assad regime, to seek a diplomatic solution to this question of chemical weapons, which is to say, to invoke the powers of the United Nations and, more importantly, something called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, an organization which just won the Nobel Peace Prize, to enter Syria, seek out its chemical weapons arsenal, and immobilize it. And that is what is proceeding. In response to the Russian offer to the United States to avoid military action by employing the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, there is an ongoing effort by that organization to remove and immobilize the chemical arsenal of the Assad regime. And it seems to be proceeding, by almost all accounts, shockingly well. This is a rare instance in which diplomatic action not only forestalled what would have been a very complicated military operation, but seems to have had a salutary effect within a relatively short period of time. So I would say that President Obama's words and actions, and probably we could say missteps, were salvaged by the Russian offer to undertake this peaceful investigation and then co-option of the Syrian chemical arsenal. So I would say this is a good outcome, but a limited one. It is in some ways a reflection of declining American influence in the region. The Americans were very mindful, American citizens and public officials, of the extraordinary risks of a military intervention. Whether it be a large or a small, there were all sorts of political and military risks. The positive side is that this instance reveals the possibilities inhering in multilateral diplomacy, an alternative to the use of American military force. Right? But having said that, questions remain. Chiefly, what's actually going on the ground in Syria? Right? We know that 100,000 people have been killed during this war between the Assad forces and the opposition, the various circles of opposition. We know that over 1 million people have been rendered refugees by this conflict, creating a very serious humanitarian crisis and risking destabilization in both Turkey and Jordan, where many of the refugees have gone. It's a very complicated picture, and I would say that the greatest and most important effects of the civil war in Syria have still not been addressed. We still have this very curious array of forces on either side, not just Assad versus that mix of opponents within Syria, but a regime, the Syrian regime, propped up by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah on one hand, and the opposition supported by a strange coalition that includes Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and various Western powers. So it remains to be seen how this will be resolved. Again, I would suggest that it is an instance that reveals the relative constraints and limitations of American power in the Middle East. Okay. I want to shift our attention now to another related problem in the following sense, namely Iran. And it's related because should the Assad regime fall, should that be an outcome of the ongoing conflict, this will have very serious consequences for Iran's chief regional supporter, namely Iran. This will have, should Assad and Syria fall, this will have very serious consequences for Iran, which has staked a great deal of its sense of regional power on its support of the Assad regime. So here we see that these two instances are closely related. All right, let's remind ourselves of Iran and the United States. The United States was a very strong supporter of the self-anointed Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, as it were, Reza Pahlavi, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, from his first days in power in 1941. The United States was a supporter because the Shah imagined himself, invented himself as a supporter of an enlightened, modern, Western, secularist regime that sought to introduce his country into the 20th century and overturn generations of traditionalist religious leadership. The United States was very committed to that ideal, supported Iran not just because of that, but because of the extraordinary oil assets that it possessed, and supported the Shah so much so that when a reformist prime minister who sought to limit American power in his country became quite popular, Mohammad Mossadegh, the CIA orchestrated a coup against him, during which he was deposed, and the Shah's own authoritarian tendencies thereby were fortified. So, like the Assads, the Shah very much supported a secularist approach to political rule. In his country, just to juxtapose things, Syria is overwhelmingly Sunni, 75% or so. This, by the way, is the region in northwest Iran where the Assad and the Alawite Muslims are based. Iran is an overwhelmingly Shiite country. But in both cases, there was a strong desire to introduce a secular regime, and this created very considerable resentment amongst the religious establishment, as well as amongst many average Iranians who weren't so willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater, throw out perhaps a less than democratic religious rule and religion with it. What hastened the process of opposition to the Shah and deepened resentment was his secret security forces, the SAVAK, which was created in 1957, which became known for its own brutal techniques. And so from that point forward, we see various forms of opposition taking rise that don't really galvanize and crystallize into a coherent force until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we see again what we saw fragments of in the case of Syria, namely secularists and religionists, we might call them, joining forces together to oppose the authoritarian regime, both in Syria and in Iran. This is one of the characteristic features of the Iranian Revolution. It was supported both by adherents of the return of traditional religious authority and secularists who believed that there was a better and more democratic way for their country. Of course, we know well that the coalition that was created in opposition to the Shah reached a pinnacle of power in the year 1978 the year in which the leader of the more traditional religious opponents of the Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini, returned from exile in Paris. 1978 begins the revolution in Iran that culminates in early 1979 with the departure of the Shah from his country. Many of us remember those images seared into our consciousness. The early years of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, during which the American embassy in Tehran was captured, was overrun, and a considerable number of embassy employees were kidnapped and held hostage for many, many months. This was a reflection of the deep resentment against American support for the Shah, really across the spectrum of opponents of the Shah in Iran. And it had extraordinarily powerful consequences for American relations with Iran. So after some 40 years or so of American support for the regime in Iran, with the revolution and the capture of the overrunning of the embassy, virtual silence and lack of connection between Iran and the United States on the diplomatic front. During that period of time, that is to say the period from 1979 to the present, Iran presented itself in the region as a regime committed to the ideal that political and religious authority could be combined, and they did so with, I would say, a growing self-assertiveness and self-confidence. In fact, we might say that Iran really imagined itself as the driving force behind the creation of a Shiite Crescent. The image of a crescent really resonates in this area, in this region. It is, after all, the site of the famous Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. Iran imagined itself as a significant regional power exporting its brand of activist political Islam, as well as the interests of the Shiite minority in the region. So it imagined a world that extended from the Arabian Sea all the way up to the borders of Turkey. It certainly imagined itself connecting, as you can see, with the Shiites in Syria and in Lebanon, with the Assad family and Hezbollah. Right? Sometimes unlikely bedfellows, other times less so. This ambition of creating a quite powerful and assertive Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Shiite Crescent, we might say, reached a pinnacle during the regime of the previous Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. During his time, Iran moved forward, as we all know, very significantly with its quest to become a nuclear power, both for military and civilian purposes. For a long time, the quest for civilian power was an aspiration that an overwhelming majority of Iranians favored, 85 to 90%. In the era of sanctions against Iran, that figure has diminished quite considerably. But nonetheless, it was Ahmadinejad's very strong desire to attain nuclear power, I would say, both for military and civilian purposes. Now, this aspiration, in the hands of someone like Ahmadinejad, a forceful, aggressive, and belligerent leader in the eyes of the West, has been the source of great concern, I needn't tell you, to the West and, of course, to Israel, an important power that we've not yet mentioned in our discussion of Iran. The United States and Israel, the great and small Satan in the familiar lexicon of Islamic sloganeering in Iran, are the great declared enemies of that country. And Ahmadinejad frequently invade against both the United States and Israel, declaring his desire to see the latter country wiped off the map. He often used, by the way, a passive voice rather than the active in describing that act, but his desires were clear in hoping for the disappearance of Israel from the world. So if you take together his rhetoric and the quest for nuclear power, you have a combustible combination, I think it's fair to say. And that combustible combination prompted the United States, together with the United Nations in 2006, to introduce sanctions against Iran. And they have had a considerable effect in terms of weakening the economic structures in place in that country. What they have not done is altogether brought to an end the Islamic Republic's quest for nuclear power. So that is more or less where we have been until very recently, when Iran elected a new president, Mr. Rouhani, who came to New York in September for the United Nations meetings and embarked upon what was almost universally called a charm offensive. One of the manifestations of that charm offensive was his Twitter greeting to the Jews of the world on the eve of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, during which he said, "As the sun is about to set here in Tehran, I wish all Jews, especially Iranian Jews, a blessed Rosh Hashanah." This was a reflection of a number of conciliatory gestures that Rouhani made to Jews, to the West, during his visit to New York and before, and that would seem to mark a turning of the page in relations between Iran and the West, Iran and the United States, which have been so damaged since 1979. The question, of course, is what to make of it. Is it an act of deception intended to buy time for the ongoing quest for nuclear power and particularly a nuclear bomb? Is it a sincere gesture intended to achieve a new level of meaning between the West and to lift the burden of sanctions, which has become quite onerous for Iran? I would say it's a little bit of both. Rouhani is not Ahmadinejad, right? Ahmadinejad's rhetoric was, just with respect to the Jews, for example, to call for the elimination of Israel and to deny the historical existence of the Holocaust. Right? As one colleague once said, if I had to choose, I'd rather someone who sent out a message of greeting on Rosh Hashanah than someone who denied the Holocaust. Right? So I think, at least at the stylistic level, there is a very considerable difference. Whether there is a significant substantive difference remains to be seen. What we have to remember is that both men were beholden to the supreme leader of Iran, the supreme religious leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, the successor to Ayatollah Khomeini. And it is really he, Khamenei, who makes all ultimate decisions in Iran, such as whether the quest towards nuclear power and a nuclear bomb should continue. Khamenei is supported by the most important military and probably also political and economic force in Iranian public life, namely the Revolutionary Guard. So he still has a very strong basis of support, and Rouhani must answer to his authority. It's not clear that Khamenei has changed his position from the days of Ahmadinejad. That remains to be seen. What is likely to happen, indeed what we've already begin to see the first stages of, is a long negotiation with the Iranians. And there may well be benefits just to the act of negotiation itself. Reducing tensions with the United States, some measure of normalization, lowering the temperature with Israel in terms of the possibility of military action between those two countries. These will be salutary benefits of negotiations, even if they don't achieve a solution. I'm not convinced that these negotiations will lead to an end to the Iranian quest for a nuclear weapon. And I'm not at all convinced that there's time to do so. I think I fear that we may be too far along. This is the argument that has been made very recently by a former national security official under the Bush administration, Kenneth Pollock, who argues that the process, the path that the Iranians have followed towards a nuclear weapon is too far along. And the options for deterring them are too inadequate or undesirable to prevent Iran getting a nuclear bomb. And therefore, the policy of future administrations will have to be one of containment, right? That familiar term from the Cold War era. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope Pollock is wrong, because the challenges that will result from Iran getting a bomb are not limited to Iran or Iran's bilateral relations. What may happen is that there will be a new kind of nuclear arms race in the Middle East, because perhaps Iran's most hated rival is not Israel in the region, but Saudi Arabia, the great defender of Sunni orthodoxy, which regards, at some level, Iran and its Shiite brand of Islam as inauthentic. That may well prompt, that is, Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons may well prompt Saudi Arabia to seek its own nuclear weapon, and then we have a dangerous escalation of nuclear weapons, something that we thought we had moved beyond. Again, I think this is an instance in which we see real limits to American power in the Middle East. The Americans can't dictate the situation. The American people is not anxious for a military conflict with Iran. It's not clear that we possess the capacity to alter the balance of power in the Iranian quest for nuclear power. So I think this is an illustration of the constraints of American power, but at the same time also an opportunity for American diplomacy. I want to conclude in just a few brief minutes by turning our attention from Iran to that source of ongoing tension with Iran that I've mentioned a few times, namely Israel. Because Israel finds itself very concerned by both Syria and Iran. It's fearful of the destabilization that is already in place in Syria and that which would follow the departure of Assad from the picture. Assad, in the eyes of many Israeli strategic analysts, is the enemy they know. He has issued many, many belligerent declarations against Israel, as did his father, but at least in the case of the son, there has been no serious escalation of tensions at the border with Israel. He would be the devil you know. What could come after him, namely a jihadi-oriented Sunni regime, is far more terrifying to the Israelis. In the case of Iran, there's also very considerable fear about its acquisition of a nuclear weapon, given the long tradition of rhetoric against Israel. That's completely understandable. And that is why Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to the United Nations shortly after President Rouhani and made a very unequivocal case for maintaining and even fortifying Western sanctions against Iran. According to Netanyahu, now is not the time to engage in diplomatic sweet talk. Now is the time to clamp down even further on Iranian aspirations so as to assure that they not gain nuclear weapons. I'm not sure he's wrong in thinking that Iran's true intentions are to gain a nuclear weapon. I'm not sure he's wrong about that. What I am sure of, at least in my own mind, is that he articulates that sentiment in ways that tend to isolate Israel from potential allies in the world. He does so by asserting the uniqueness and loneliness of Israel in the world, by asserting and almost relishing that position of loneliness in the world. And in this regard, He operates very much in the shadows of his own father, who was a very well-known historian by the name of Benzion Netanyahu, who evinced in the course of his decades of work, 60 or 70 years of historical labor, the belief that Jews do stand alone in the world, that in fact the world is unrelentingly opposed to the existence of Jews in their midst. And there is a grain of truth in that, but a grain of truth. That is to say, the enmity of the world, of many different countries against Jews is well known, but at the same time, Jews have managed to flourish in many, many settings from antiquity to the present, and that's a point that was never prominent in the father of Netanyahu, and the son has, to a certain extent, absorbed it. So I think he has become a very ineffective messenger for his country on this issue of Iran and how to proceed. Though ultimately, he may be right that Iran wants to and is somewhat unequivocally committed to achieving the status of a nuclear power. So where does this leave Israel? Netanyahu's rhetoric or not? In a very tough position. The world seems willing to hear out Rouhani to see if his rhetoric will be borne out, or whether he'll be reined in by the supreme leader, Khamenei. And meanwhile, on the local front, there is growing pressure on Israel to alter its policy with regard to the Palestinians. So, for example, the European Union recently decided in the summer to boycott Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And that marks, I would say, an increasing step in delegitimizing Israel's 66-year policy of building settlements there. Secretary of State John Kerry recognizes that this is really a crucial moment to try and move forward negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians in light of all these other challenges that are occurring at a dramatic clip in the Middle East. And he, in fact, has tried to convene the Israelis and the Palestinians to commence a process of negotiation, which has started and is now in its third month. The efforts haven't gained a great deal of traction. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of breakthrough so far, but we're reaching a very critical juncture in the history of this conflict. We may be reaching the point at which a two-state solution is no longer possible. And that is because, as you can see on the map on the left, to the extent that you can see it, Israeli settlements are deeply embedded in that area that would become the state of Palestine, the West Bank. So deeply rooted as to be possibly inextricable. So that produces a tremendous, maybe game-changing complication on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, there's a completely divided entity. Right? As you know, the Palestinian polity is divided into a more secularist regime in the West Bank and a more Islamist regime in the Gaza Strip. What would have to happen for a two-state solution to take rise is for a significant Israeli withdrawal of the settlements from the West Bank and for some sort of unification of the Palestinian polity. I would say that both of those are, in present circumstances, unlikely. Unlikely. And that is one reason why we increasingly hear calls, including in the newspaper of record of this country, the New York Times, for a world in which Israelis and Palestinians live together under one state. So some of you may have seen several weeks ago the call, not so much the call, but the prediction by the political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, Ian Lustig, that we are entering a new era, the era of the single state, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Okay? And to the point that Lustig calls the previous model of diplomatic solution an illusion, the two-state illusion. So this leaves the future very unclear in this third hotspot that is closely connected to the previous two that I've spoken about. What will it look like? Can the two-state solution be salvaged? Are we headed toward a one-state solution? What kind of single state? A state of all its citizens, a binational state? In an era of declining American influence in the region, at the tail end of a long period of Western colonial intervention in the Middle East, in a period in which we see resurgent expressions of Islamic political will, it would seem that Israel had a great deal of vested interest in moving as urgently as possible to secure its borders and its demographic viability as a Jewish state as much as possible. That's what logic would seem to suggest to me. This is a vision, by the way, that was embraced to a certain extent by the old guard Palestinian leadership, the old secularist leadership symbolized by Yasser Arafat. So logic and even the old leadership on the Palestinian side and virtually every Israeli prime minister have all articulated the ideal of a two-state solution, but their actions on all sides seem to point in a different direction. Rather, what we have seen is ongoing enmity and inertia, really from the arrival of the first Zionist settlers in Palestine in the late 19th century. How to overcome that enmity and the forces of momentum that have created the realities on the ground that we see today is a great challenge. Where does this leave us? So I think you have a sense that this is a time of great uncertainty in the Middle East. I'm not sure that we've seen yet the full effects of the rise of the Middle States. I still think we're headed to a world dominated by the Middle States, but we have to be mindful of two factors. First, there is fierce intra-Arab and intra-Muslim tension, especially between Shiites and Sunnis that have come to the fore in recent years. Second, we do see diminished influence by the United States to assert its will, a feature that we see the world over that is, of course, accompanied by the ascendance of China as a major world power. And we'll have to see how that relationship turns out. In navigating its way, I think the United States has little choice at this point, but first, to follow the course of chemical weapons inspection with the United Nations in the case of Syria, to do so with a mix of hope and caution. Dialogue, it seems to me, hasn't been tried. It's worth trying, and we'll just have to see how it proceeds. Sanctions remain an option. I think ultimately Iran is so close to a nuclear weapon that it will achieve one. Where the United States does have the capacity to exert its influence is not so much in Syria, not so much in Iran, but in the case of Israel-Palestine, by encouraging, even requiring, the two sides to overcome their own stubbornness, to cajole them to accept what I often think of in the terms of Churchill, the worst solution there is except for all of the others, namely the two-state solution. What you need to get that done is a two-term American president who doesn't have to worry about running for re-election. That is what we have in President Obama, but he may be in too weakened a position at this point to pull it off. Now, at one level, that's very distressing, but at another level, and I'll conclude with this mildly optimistic note, that decline of American influence and the weakened position of President Obama open up the prospect of a more multilateral world in which responsibility is more evenly shared, and that indeed could be a good thing. So with that, I'll leave it. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah. Yes, sir, please.
I have a question. Israel is a nuclear armed state. Iran, the American public doesn't have the go into Iran to stop them militarily to get from getting a nuclear bomb. Israel's nuclear deterrence could never hold up against Iran if they did get a bomb, because geographically they're so small. And one of the theories, or during the Cold War, was the mutually assured destruction. that would be on balance between Iran and Israel. Do you think the United States should, similarly what we did with the NATO countries during the Cold War, and extend our nuclear umbrella to Israel, that if Iran does get a bomb, that the United States would back up Iran or Israel to make sure that mutually assured destruction theory is within the Iranian future?
Right. I think that the logic of MAD, of mutual assured destruction, is probably the best hope we have for that containment world that I think we're headed to. Whether or not the United States plays a significant role in amplifying the Israeli arsenal or not, I don't know. Israel has the capacity to obliterate Iran from the face of the earth. So it doesn't need additional nuclear weapons to do that. They have the capacity to do that. As you point out, it doesn't take a lot on the Iranian side to wipe Israel off the face of the earth because of its size. The question is, can that logic of MAD obtain when dealing with the Iranian regime? That, it seems to me, is the question. Now, remember that during the dark days of the Cold War, there were many Americans who imagined Soviet leaders as diabolical, as crazy, as fanatically committed to the destruction of the United States as many of us impute to Iranian leaders. My own intuition, and it's not based on any inside knowledge, my own intuition is that Iranian political and military leaders are sufficiently rational actors to operate according to the rules of that game. What I think the United States would be very cautious about, it would be very tempted, I think it would be very tempted to do this, to extend the nuclear umbrella not just to Israel, but to other American allies in the region. And that I think is the terrifying prospect that we might be heading for, understandable as it is, such that certainly Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey could all see the need to obtain their own nuclear weapons to protect their interests. That could be something that the United States, in a certain world, might well have an interest in supporting. That would extend the nuclear umbrella and accelerate an arms race in ways that could be absolutely devastating. So I'm not sure I would like to see that, but that I could see as a future policy initiative of the United States, to extend the umbrella beyond Israel to other putative allies. And again, who knows how Egypt will turn out next week. Who knows how it will turn out, but that is a direction I could see. Yes, please.
Oh, thank you. Why, if the two leaders of Israel are so interested in the two-state solution, why do they continue to allow building in the West Bank? Because that seems to me such a pivotal problem, and they just keep doing it.
Yeah. Without regard to political affiliation, Labor, Likud, one after the other,
I mean, it's just
one after the other,
doing this all the time.
one after the other. Yes, you're right about that. I think there are a couple of possible answers. There is a political response and there is an ideological response, where there's a political explanation and an ideological explanation. The political explanation is that they at some level understand how difficult it would be to pull off in terms of dealing with a small but extraordinarily vocal, potent, and armed opposition. Namely, there's various levels to this. The settlers' lobby has a power far beyond its numbers, and has, I think in a certain sense, intimidated Israeli prime ministers into continuing the process of building on a regular basis, despite the fact that it may not be in Israel's best interest.
Where's the power coming from?
The power ultimately comes from the threat of mobilizing a civil war in Israel. Therein lies the power. This is something that Israeli prime ministers have been deeply frightened of. And I think as far as I can tell, would be one reason why they ultimately will not do what is in their best interests, which is to say, withdraw a substantial number of settlements. Instead, because what they will countenance, well, the odds are that the overwhelming majority of the settlers situated in settlements that would need to be evacuated would agree to return to the Green Line, to the 1949 armistice lines. A substantial minority of the settlers would not. How many they are, we don't know, 50,000, 100,000. They're the 50 or 100,000 of the most ideologically committed, the most armed, and the most committed to fighting for their homes. I believe that that relatively small constituency in a country of 8 million people holds the fate of the country and has held the fate of the country since 1973. No prime minister has had the courage to confront them. Sharon attempted at a much smaller level in Gaza by withdrawing Israel settlements there. This is a constituency that is anywhere from 7 to 20 times larger. I think they've intimidated Israeli political culture and Israeli prime ministers. So that's the political response, the potency of the settlers' lobby and the threat of violence. The ideological response is that this settlement project taps into very deep features of the Zionist project, which is to settle the land, either because it's divinely mandated or because it is historically conditioned. And I think every Israeli prime minister has, at some level, resonated with that ideological proposition. So as a matter of coherent, lucid policy, they say, yes, we should do this, but almost always after the fact. I mean, the most famous example of this was Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who in a famous interview, Rosh Hashanah 2007, said, here's what we need to do. And it was a very far-reaching plan for Israel getting out of the West Bank, the division of Jerusalem, some symbolic resolution, some significant resolution of the refugee question, including symbolic return of a number of refugees to Israel proper. And yet he issued it at the end of his tenure. In other words, he hadn't acted upon precisely those tenets that he thought essential to the survival of the country. There is something in your confusion that I share. I don't understand the clash between what would seem to be completely self-evident. Namely, if Israel is to survive as a Jewish state, whether one embraces that or not is not the question. If Israel is to survive as a Jewish state, it absolutely must withdraw from the West Bank. If it does not, then the region between the Jordan and the Mediterranean become one political entity, and within a very short period of time, the Jews will be significantly outnumbered. So I can only gesture at responses to your question because at some level, a coherent answer defies me as well.
One more question.
Could you talk a little bit about the role of the military in the countries you've discussed and in Turkey and Egypt? I think their role as a social entity and political force in these countries is a bit hard for Westerners to understand.
The role of the military?
The role of the military.
Well, yeah.
Not just a military force.
Right. Well, so there are different elements to this question. I'll try and just answer it briefly. First, in Syria, the military is very closely related to and controlled by the Assad family and Alawite associates of the Assad. So it's very much associated, certainly the leadership of the military, very much associated with a single family and tribe, right? Which does not make it a people's army, which makes it very top-heavy, and which would seem to allow for dissent to develop at the rank and file. And that's what finally happened after 40 years of oppressive rule from on high. In Iran, there are various different military units though the most important of them is, as I mentioned, the Revolutionary Guard, which is the most ideologically committed to continuing the Islamic Revolution by exporting its ideals beyond Iran's border. One of the very interesting features of the Revolutionary Guard is not only its commitment to the ideals of the revolution, but the extent to which it has extended its tentacles into virtually every aspect of Iranian economic life, such that it is a major owner of many national concerns: telecommunications, computers, manufacturing. As a way of asserting and fortifying its control, it decided to enter the economic sphere. And so its functions move somewhat seamlessly between fortifying the masses in ideological terms, waging battle, and controlling the economy. In Israel, the army is the central socializing force in that country's society. It is a people's army that takes as its, or it has been a people's army that takes as its recruits virtually every able-bodied person, with the exception of traditionalist Orthodox Jews and most Arab citizens of Israel. So that's been the traditional model. In recent years, the rate of Israelis choosing or seeking not to join the army has risen dramatically, such that as many as 25% of the rest of Israel, other than those groups that I mentioned, choose or are able to get out of army service. That's an interesting new development that suggests somehow a widening gap between the ideals of the army and the ideals of these individuals, a loosening of the ideological coherency of Israel as the fulfillment of the Zionist project. You mentioned Turkey and a number of others. That's a very complicated set of factors that I don't think we have time for now, but I'd be happy to talk to you about later. Thank you.
Thanks to David, and thanks for a rather thoroughgoing, if not cheery, presentation, but a very illuminating, and thank you all for coming. See you next time.